Rachel stood at the edge of the gathering, feeling like an outsider in her own life. The laughter that echoed across the room was sharp and biting, as if everyone had suddenly become a critic, and she was the subject of their amusement. She adjusted the delicate straps of her dress, feeling the weight of every eye that lingered on her. The soft fabric of the gown, once a symbol of elegance and comfort, now felt like a prison. Her husband, Mark, stood nearby with his arm wrapped around the slender waist of Serena, his lover. Serena's laughter rang out, high-pitched and carefree, like a melody played just a bit too loud. Mark's gaze, usually filled with warmth when it met Rachel's, now held something far colder. The smirk on his lips was unmistakable. It wasn't just a smile. It was a weapon, carefully crafted to wound. "Did you pick that up from a second-hand store?" Mark's voice was loud enough to carry across the room, cutting through the chatter like a blade. His words were sharp and deliberate, meant to land with precision. Serena leaned in closer, her fingers brushing against his arm in a way that felt too intimate, too possessive. She smirked at Rachel as if to say, "You don't belong here." The subtle movement of Serena's hand against Mark's sleeve was a silent display of her dominance, and Rachel felt the sting in her chest, the deep ache of being invisible in the presence of someone who wasn't just younger, but also everything she could never be in Mark's eyes. "I didn't know they still made clothes like that," Mark added, his words dripping with venom, each syllable soaked in mockery. His tone was casual, as if he were discussing the weather, but the sharpness of his words cut through Rachel with surgical precision. Rachel's fingers tightened around her wine glass, the cold stem pressing against her palm, grounding her in the moment. The weight of the glass seemed to increase with every insult that followed. She could feel the eyes of his friends on her, dissecting her appearance, enjoying the discomfort that radiated from her. A part of her wanted to flee, to turn and run out of the room, but she stayed. She couldn't let them see her fall apart, even if every ounce of her wanted to break down right then and there. She clung to the facade of composure, the mask she had worn so many times before, a mask that she knew would soon crack under the weight of this cruelty. Rachel had been mocked before. It wasn't new, but something about tonight felt different. This time it wasn't just a private insult. This time Mark had done it in front of everyone, his friends, his colleagues, Serena, people who, as far as Rachel knew, were supposed to be on her side. The dress she wore was one she had once worn when Mark first met her. It was a soft, elegant blue, a gown he had admired for its simplicity, its grace. But tonight, it felt like a costume, a relic from a time when their love had been genuine. Now it was nothing more than a prop in Mark's cruel performance, a tool to make her feel small, to demonstrate his power over her. Mark's eyes flicked over her, scanning her from head to toe, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Wow, retro," he said with a chuckle, his voice laced with condescension. "How charming." His words were not meant as a compliment. They were a reminder of how far she had fallen in his eyes, how irrelevant she had become in his world. Rachel forced a smile, though it felt like the muscles in her face were betraying her. It was a weak, strained smile, one that she hoped would mask the storm that was swirling inside her. She wanted to scream, to throw her glass at his feet and shatter the illusion of their marriage that had so carefully been built over the years. She wanted to break the charade, to let everyone know that the man standing next to Serena was not the person he pretended to be. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she stood there, silent, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow. Years of enduring Mark's subtle jabs and dismissive tone had taught her the value of silence. Silence was her weapon. It was sharp, calculated, and deadly when wielded correctly. Tonight, however, she wasn't sure if silence would be enough. Serena's laugh cut through the air, high-pitched and cruel, more mocking than any of Mark's words. It was a sound that made Rachel feel invisible, as if she were nothing more than a ghost in the room, something to be laughed at, discarded, and ignored. Serena's voice was the kind of sound that oozed superiority, as if she had already won the prize that Rachel had once thought was hers. "Oh, come on, Mark," Serena cooed, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Don't be so harsh. I think it's charming. Retro, maybe? Rachel's stomach churned at the word. Charming? Retro? They weren't just mocking her dress. They were mocking everything about her, her choices, her identity, her worth. It wasn't just the dress that was under scrutiny. It was Rachel herself, reduced to nothing more than a joke, a relic of a past that Tom had long since discarded. She glanced around the room, searching for a friendly face, a sign that someone cared, someone who saw beyond the cruel jokes and the laughter. But she found nothing. His friends, carefully chosen, carefully curated, were too eager to join in on the ridicule. They laughed in unison, their voices blending with the background music, a cruel symphony orchestrated by Mark himself. Rachel took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. She was no stranger to mockery. This wasn't the first time Mark had humiliated her. But this time, it felt different, felt worse. She had always been able to bury her emotions, to stuff them deep down inside, to pretend that everything was okay. But tonight, she couldn't. Tonight, something inside her cracked. The humiliation was no longer something she could laugh off or ignore. It was real, and it hurt. She excused herself from the group, her voice calm despite the storm that raged inside her. "Excuse me," she muttered, her words barely above a whisper, though they felt like a shout in her own ears. The moment she stepped away from the crowd, Rachel felt a rush of air as if she could finally breathe again. But it wasn't relief. It was just a momentary reprieve, a chance to steady herself before she faced the truth of what had just happened. She made her way toward the restroom, the cool tiles beneath her feet grounding her. But even that offered little comfort. As the door clicked shut behind her, Rachel leaned against the sink, her hands gripping the porcelain as if it were the only thing keeping her from crumbling to the floor. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, unable to recognize the woman staring back at her. The face was familiar, but the eyes were hollow. She didn't recognize the woman who had become a shadow of herself, the one who had allowed Mark's mockery to eat away at her sense of self-worth. How had she become this person? How had she allowed herself to shrink so much that she couldn't even recognize her own reflection? She used to be strong, independent, confident, full of dreams and ambitions. And now all she saw in the mirror was a stranger, a woman who had been worn down by years of subtle digs and dismissive glances. A woman who had once believed in love, in partnership, but who now stood alone in a restroom, fighting to hold on to the scraps of her dignity. But deep down, beneath the hurt, something began to stir inside Rachel. A quiet, steady fire began to burn, a sense of determination, of defiance. It wasn't over. Not yet. And maybe it was time to stop pretending that everything was fine. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for Mark to change, to stop begging for approval from someone who had long since stopped caring. Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself as she wiped away the remnants of the tears she hadn't realized had fallen. She wasn't going to let him break her. Not tonight. Not ever again. With one last glance in the mirror, Rachel straightened her back and opened the door. She would return to that party. She would face Mark. But this time, she wouldn't be the woman he had mocked. She would be someone else. A woman who had finally started to see herself for who she really was. A woman who deserved better. Rachel leaned against the sink, staring at the woman in the mirror. She barely recognized herself anymore. Her face, once radiant with confidence, now looked hollow, eyes dulled by years of neglect and emotional bruising. Her lips, once quick to smile, were tight, pressed together in a thin line that betrayed no emotion. There she was, staring back at a stranger, someone who had lost her way somewhere along the path she had walked with Mark. But that wasn't who she was. Not really. Not anymore. How had she let herself shrink this much? She had once been so full of life, eager to chase dreams, to build something meaningful. She had loved fiercely, believed deeply in the bonds that tied her to others. But somewhere along the way, all of that had eroded. The laughter, the jokes, the insults. Each one had worn her down, little by little, until she had become a shadow of the woman she had once been. But as she stood there in that cold, sterile restroom, something inside her began to stir. It wasn't just the sting of Mark's words that hurt. It was the realization that she had allowed herself to be treated this way for far too long. She had stayed, even when she knew in her heart that things weren't right. She had put up with his cruelty because she thought it was easier to remain than to face the fear of what might come next. But now, she wasn't sure she could stay silent any longer. Her hands tightened around the edge of the sink, feeling the cool porcelain beneath her fingertips. The anger inside her began to bubble up, mingling with the hurt. For so long, she had tried to be the good wife, the supportive partner. She had tried to fit into the life Mark had designed for her. She had buried her own desires, her dreams, and her needs in the name of love and loyalty. But love wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to make you feel small, invisible, or unworthy. Rachel's chest tightened as she took in a shaky breath. This wasn't just about the mocking. It wasn't just about Mark and Serena or the laughter that had pierced her heart. It was about the years of silence, the years of ignoring her own worth for the sake of a marriage that had never truly valued her. It was about all the moments she had spent convincing herself that it was okay to be treated like this, that she should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection Mark had thrown her way. She stood straighter now, her spine rigid as the anger solidified into something else, something far stronger. It wasn't just resentment that she was feeling. It was a realization that she didn't have to stay in this life of quiet suffering. She didn't have to accept his cruelty. It was time to take back what had been taken from her, piece by piece. Rachel's hand reached for the bottle of water on the counter, her fingers steady despite the storm swirling inside. She needed clarity. She needed to breathe. Her reflection in the mirror was still unfamiliar, but she could see a flicker of something there. A spark of determination, an ember of resolve that hadn't been there before. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she walked into this room. Not anymore. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left an entire room of journalists in stunned silence, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. As Rachel wiped away the last of the tears she hadn't realized had fallen, a quiet sense of resolve washed over her. She wasn't going to let Mark's words define her any longer. She wasn't going to let him break her. Not now. Not ever again. Taking one final look at her reflection, Rachel straightened her dress and stepped away from the sink. The woman who had walked into this room, small, hurt, and questioning, was gone. In her place stood someone else. Someone who had finally started to see her own worth. And that person was ready to face whatever came next, no matter how painful, no matter how difficult. Because for the first time in years, she was no longer afraid to be herself. With one last deep breath, Rachel turned toward the door and walked out of the restroom, ready to face the world again. Ready to face Mark. Ready to face herself. Rachel stepped back into the room, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor as she re-entered the party. The noise of chatter and laughter hit her at once, but it no longer felt like the same world she had just left behind. The people in the room seemed distant, like shadows, as though she were seeing them through a fog, a veil that had lifted and revealed everything for what it was. The judgment, the mockery, the laughter. It all seemed so far away now, as if it belonged to someone else's life, not hers. She could feel the eyes on her the moment she stepped through the door. Mark's gaze flickered briefly in her direction, but it wasn't the loving look he used to give her. No, this was different. His eyes narrowed slightly, his lips twitching as if he were trying to figure out what was happening. Rachel had always been easy to read, predictable in her reactions, but tonight, everything had changed. Serena stood beside him, her arms still curled around his, looking at Rachel with a mixture of curiosity and smug superiority. The soft flicker of a smile danced at the corners of Serena's lips, as though she were enjoying the quiet tension building in the air. Rachel's heart didn't race. There was no panic, no flood of insecurity. Instead, there was something else, something steadier, stronger, rising from deep within her. She walked to the bar, each step deliberate, a quiet echo of the strength she was beginning to realize she had always possessed. The bartender gave her a quick, courteous smile as she approached, but it was the glass of water she ordered that felt like a symbol. A moment of calm amidst the chaos, a sign that she was no longer rattled by the disarray that had so easily shaken her in the past. As Rachel sipped the water, she glanced around the room. She had always hated these kinds of gatherings. The hollow small talk, the forced smiles, the air thick with pretense. It used to make her feel so out of place, so invisible, like she was merely an accessory to Mark's life. She was his wife, yes, but more often than not, she had been reduced to just that. The woman who stood behind him, never in front, never truly seen for who she was. Tonight, however, Rachel felt different. There was a clarity in her mind now that hadn't existed before. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She wasn't here to play the part of the perfect wife, to bend and twist herself into shapes she thought others wanted to see. No, tonight, she was here for herself. For the first time in a long time, she was not afraid to stand tall, to exist in a room full of people who had never truly bothered to know her. Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. "Everything okay, darling?" His tone was mockingly sweet, that sarcastic edge barely concealed beneath the words. It was a game he had always played, a way to provoke her, to see how far he could push her before she snapped. Rachel turned slowly to face him, her smile poised but sharp, an expression that spoke of control. "Everything's perfect, Mark," she replied, her voice steady and cool. There was no hesitation, no falter in her words. "Absolutely perfect." She held his gaze, and for the first time in years, she didn't look away. Mark's eyebrows shot up in surprise. It was subtle, but it was there. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the momentary confusion that flashed across his face. He wasn't sure how to read her anymore. His mouth opened slightly, as if to make another sarcastic comment, but Rachel beat him to it. "Isn't it funny?" she continued, her voice cutting through the tension. "How easy it is to believe that everything is fine when you've spent so long pretending that it is?" The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning. There was a ripple of silence that spread through the room, a subtle shift in the atmosphere as the other guests turned their attention toward the conversation. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing ever so slightly, but his gaze never left hers. Serena, standing by his side, watched the exchange with a knowing smirk, but even she seemed unsure of how to react. Rachel wasn't playing the game anymore. She wasn't the passive wife who could be brushed aside. "Rachel, what are you talking about?" Mark's voice was tinged with annoyance now, the facade of confidence slipping. "It's just a party, you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Rachel's laugh was short, almost bitter. "No, Mark. What's overreacting is the way you've treated me. For years. What's overreacting is making me feel like I'm nothing more than a joke, a footnote in your perfect little life." Her words cut through the air like shards of glass, each one more deliberate than the last. "But you know what? I'm not going to play along anymore. Not tonight. Not ever again." She felt the energy in the room shift, felt the weight of her words land, not just on Mark, but on everyone around her. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't begging. She wasn't apologizing for the way she felt. She was simply saying the truth, and that was enough to make everyone else uncomfortable. Mark's face hardened, his jaw clenched, and for a moment, Rachel thought he might lash out. But he didn't. Instead, there was an awkward silence. His pride, so carefully cultivated over the years, was beginning to crack. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to stand her ground. For a long beat, no one spoke. The music played softly in the background, the laughter and chatter from earlier fading into the distance. In that moment, it was just Rachel and Mark. Two people standing at the crossroads of something that had been broken beyond repair. Rachel could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but it wasn't fear that gripped her anymore. It was something else. It was clarity. It was control. She glanced over her shoulder at Serena, who stood there, her arms crossed over her chest, her lips still curled in a smug expression. But Rachel saw the shift in her too. Serena had always been confident, but now she looked a little more unsure of herself. like the power dynamic had changed just a little in a way she couldn't quite understand. Rachel took a deep breath, straightened her back, and finally turned away from them both. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had been living in their shadow for so long, but tonight, she was stepping into the light. And for the first time in ages, she didn't feel the need to hide. As she walked across the room, her heart still racing but her steps steady, Rachel realized something. She had never truly been invisible. It had only ever been that she had allowed herself to be. Tonight, that ended. But as she made her way toward the exit, there was a part of her that felt the smallest flicker of hope. For the first time in years, Rachel wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of losing Mark, or Serena, or anyone else who had tried to define her. She wasn't afraid of the judgment or the sneers or the gossip. She had taken control of her own life and no one could take that from her. Before I continue with what happens next, I want to know your thoughts. Have you ever had to take control of your life in the face of adversity? Drop a comment below and share your story. And don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready to see what happens next. Because trust me, you won't want to miss it. Rachel knew that the road ahead would be tough, but she also knew this. She was finally walking it on her own terms. And nothing, not Mark, not Serena, not anyone, could change that. The night stretched on, but Rachel felt a shift in the air. The laughter and music from the party blurred into an almost surreal backdrop. She could still feel the cold weight of the glass in her hand, but this time it wasn't grounding her. It was a reminder of how far she had let herself fall and how far she had come. She could feel the walls of the room pressing in, but they weren't closing around her anymore. She wasn't trapped. As she moved through the party, her mind kept returning to the same thought. It's time to confront him. She had been avoiding this moment for far too long. Mark, or Tom as she had been calling him in her mind over the years, a name that had once been full of affection, now felt foreign, something she could no longer associate with the man standing before her, had spent years chipping away at her self-worth. And now, after everything, she wasn't going to let him win. Not anymore. As the evening continued, Rachel felt the pull to leave, to end this evening of charades and deceit. But something stopped her. Something told her that now was the moment. She couldn't leave just yet. Not before she had said everything that had been building inside her for years. She excused herself, telling the few remaining guests she was going to get some fresh air, and made her way to the car. The cool night air bit at her skin as she stepped outside, but it only seemed to sharpen her resolve. As she stood by the car, her breath coming in shallow bursts, she thought about the road ahead. There would be no turning back from this. A few minutes later, Tom walked out the door, his steps slow as he approached her, clearly trying to maintain an air of casual indifference. But Rachel could see it in his eyes. There was a flicker of unease, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. He didn't know what she was about to say, but she could feel that he knew something had changed, and he didn't like it. "Rachel, what's going on?" Tom asked, his voice softer than usual, laced with a thin veneer of concern. "You okay?" Her eyes narrowed. His tone was that of a man trying to control the situation, trying to regain the power he thought he had lost. But Rachel wasn't buying it anymore. She had spent so long believing his lies, excusing his actions, convincing herself that she could fix things, that she could make him love her again. But that was before. Now there was no more pretending. "No, Tom, I'm not okay," Rachel replied, her voice calm but firm. "And I haven't been okay for a long time. I've been pretending, making excuses, because I thought I had to. But I don't have to anymore. Not now. Not after everything." Tom's face hardened. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Rachel took a deep breath, standing taller than she had in years. "I mean this," she said, her words coming out sharper, more deliberate. "I mean the way you've treated me, the way you've mocked me in front of everyone tonight, the way you've humiliated me, over and over, for years." Tom's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, the usual defensive sneer forming on his lips. "Oh, come on. It was just a joke. You're overreacting. You know how they are. You've always been so sensitive." Rachel clenched her fists at her sides, the anger rising in her chest. Sensitive? She repeated, her voice a little louder now, filled with disbelief. Is that what you think this is? You think I'm just sensitive? No, Tom. This isn't about sensitivity. This is about respect. And you've given me none. None. She paused for a moment, steadying herself, not allowing him to shift the conversation, not allowing him to play the same tired game. Do you even realize how you've made me feel over the years? How you've chipped away at my self-worth, made me feel like I was nothing. Every little comment, every dismissive glance, every time you made me the butt of your jokes. Do you even care? Tom looked away briefly, his jaw tightening. This is ridiculous, Rachel. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just having fun. Why are you making a big deal out of this? Rachel's laugh was bitter, edged with years of frustration. You were having fun? She echoed. You think humiliating me in front of your friends is fun? You think it's funny to make me feel worthless, to make me feel like I'm nothing more than a joke? Tom's silence spoke volumes. He didn't have an answer. Instead, he scoffed, as if dismissing her pain with a wave of his hand. You're being dramatic. You always do this, Rachel. You blow things out of proportion. You're so emotional. His words stung, but they no longer had the power they once did. Rachel stood her ground, refusing to let him manipulate her feelings any longer. You want to know why I'm emotional, Tom? It's because for years, I've put up with you. I've let you treat me like I'm not enough, like my feelings don't matter. I've put my dreams, my goals, myself aside just to be what you wanted me to be. But not anymore. Her chest heaved with the weight of her words, the years of pain spilling out, layer by layer, like peeling away old wounds. I let you do it, Tom. I let you mock me. I let you ignore me. I let you break me down because I thought I had to. I thought I had to earn your love. But you don't get to treat me like this anymore. Not tonight. Not ever again. The silence between them stretched out, thick with tension. Tom stood there, his face flushed with anger, his fists clenched at his sides, but Rachel wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what he might do, of what he might say. She had heard it all before. The excuses, the apologies, the promises that never came true. And she was done with it. You think I don't know what you've been doing behind my back? Rachel continued, her voice a little quieter now, but no less determined. I know, Tom. I know about you and Serena. I've seen the way you look at her, the way you touch her. I'm not blind. I'm not stupid. I know what's been going on, and I'm done pretending like I don't. Tom's face went white. For a moment, it seemed like all the color drained from his features. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Rachel could see the guilt creeping in, the cracks beginning to show in his carefully constructed facade. I never wanted it to be like this, he finally muttered, his voice low and defensive. It's not like you think. Serena means nothing. She's just a friend. Rachel shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. A friend? Really, Tom? A friend who's always there, always by your side, always hanging on your every word? Don't lie to me. I know the truth. And so do you. Tom took a step toward her, his face contorted with frustration, but Rachel held her ground. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away before he could touch her. Stop, she said, her voice steady but firm. Don't touch me. For a moment, Tom seemed to falter. His eyes searched hers, as if trying to find some shred of the woman he had once known, the woman who had been so easily manipulated, so eager to please him. But that woman was gone. Rachel took a deep breath and stood taller. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going to be the woman who silently suffers, who waits for you to change. I'm done. And I'm not going to beg for your love anymore. You don't get to treat me like this. She looked at him one last time, her heart beating steadily in her chest, the weight of everything she had endured settling into her bones. She wasn't going to crumble. She wasn't going to beg for a man who didn't deserve her. Rachel turned away from him, the finality of her decision settling over her like a cloak. There would be no more second chances, no more empty promises. She wasn't going to play the victim anymore. This was her moment, and she was taking control. Before she walked away, she looked over her shoulder one last time. Tom stood there, watching her. A mix of guilt, frustration, and confusion etched across his face. But Rachel didn't need his approval. She didn't need anything from him anymore. With one final step, she left him behind. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt the weight of the world lifting off her shoulders. The silence that followed was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Rachel's heart raced as she walked away from Tom, the distance between them growing with each step. She didn't look back, couldn't look back. Not when she knew what was waiting for her if she did. The air outside felt sharper, more alive than it ever had before. The cool breeze swept across her skin like a cleansing breath, washing away the weight of years spent in silence, spent hiding the truth. Her fingers were still trembling as she reached for her car keys. But this time it wasn't fear that made her hands shake. No, it was something else. Something far stronger. It was the sense of freedom, the kind that came when you finally let go of a life that was never meant to be yours. For the first time in years, Rachel felt like she was breathing for herself. And it was terrifying. She got in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she pulled out of the parking lot. The streets blurred past her, the headlights casting long shadows across the road. But Rachel wasn't focused on the night. She wasn't focused on where she was going. All she could think about was the decision she had just made, the decision to finally leave. The weight of it settled over her like a blanket, comforting in some ways, suffocating in others. She had always thought she would leave someday. She had dreamed of it, fantasized about it when the hurt got too much to bear. But tonight it wasn't a fantasy. It was real. And with that reality came an emptiness, a quiet ache deep inside her, the kind that made her wonder what was next. What did life look like after you finally took control? After you cut the cord that had bound you to someone else's expectations? Rachel's eyes stung with the tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed earlier. It wasn't just sadness. It was relief. It was the kind of grief that comes when you let go of something you've held on to for far too long, even though you knew it was wrong for you. She had spent years in a relationship that had drained her, that had reduced her to someone she didn't recognize. But she was done. She was done pretending, done waiting for things to change, done sacrificing herself for a man who couldn't see her worth. As the city lights flickered past her window, Rachel realized she was no longer waiting for permission. She wasn't waiting for anyone to tell her what to do or how to feel. For the first time in ages, she was doing it for herself. The road ahead was uncertain. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep living a lie. Her apartment wasn't much. It was small, with just enough space to fit her and her things. But it was hers, no one else's. It was a space that smelled like fresh paint, like new beginnings. It felt strange, being in a place all her own, without the echoes of Mark's presence, without the weight of his expectations hanging over her. The silence was different now. It wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. It was her silence. Rachel dropped her suitcase onto the bed, her body sagging with exhaustion. But there was something else there too, something lighter. As she looked around, she realized that she could fill this space however she wanted. There were no rules here, no constraints. This was her life, her space, her choice. And for the first time in years, that felt like everything. She sank into the small armchair in the corner, pulling her knees up to her chest, feeling the weight of everything she had just done. She wasn't sure what the next steps were. She didn't have a roadmap. But that didn't matter right now. What mattered was that she had taken the first step. She had made the decision to leave. And that decision, even in its uncertainty, felt like the beginning of something new. The phone buzzed on the table beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Laura, the one person who had always been there for her, the one person who had never judged her or made her feel less than she was. "How are you?" The message read, simple but full of meaning. Rachel smiled faintly, her fingers hovering over the screen as she typed her reply. "I'm okay. Actually, I'm more than okay. I'm free." She hit send and sat back, letting the words sink in. She didn't need to explain. Laura would understand. She always did. In the days that followed, Rachel took small steps toward rebuilding her life. There were moments of doubt, moments when the loneliness crept in, when she wondered if she had made the right decision. But each day she grew stronger. Each day, she reminded herself that leaving wasn't just about escaping Tom. It was about reclaiming herself. It was about giving herself the chance to rebuild the woman she had lost somewhere along the way. The first thing she did was take control of her finances. Mark had always managed everything, her money, his money, their shared expenses, but that was part of the control he had wielded over her. Now it was time to take it back. She opened a separate bank account, set up new systems, and made sure she knew exactly where she stood. There was power in this, power in knowing that she was capable of standing on her own. But it wasn't just about finances. Rachel began to reconnect with herself in ways she had long forgotten. She enrolled in a business course she had always wanted to take, something she had put off for years because Tom never seemed to think it was necessary. The first day of class felt like a small victory. As she walked into that room full of strangers, her mind buzzing with excitement instead of fear. She was doing something for herself, for the first time in so long, and it felt good. She started to write again, too. She used to write in journals, scribbling down her thoughts and dreams, but somewhere along the way, she had stopped. Now, every evening, after a long day of work or class, she would sit down and pour her thoughts onto the pages, letting the words flow freely. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was hers. Rachel also reached out to old friends, the ones she had lost touch with when Mark had isolated her from them. It felt strange at first, sending messages to people she hadn't spoken to in years, but the responses she received were nothing short of warm. They were happy to hear from her, supportive and understanding. Slowly, she began to rebuild those connections, strengthening the bonds that had always been there but had been ignored for far too long. The nights were still quiet, but they were no longer filled with a sense of dread. Rachel slept better now, knowing that she was no longer living someone else's life, knowing that she was finally living her own. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it. She wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. In fact, she had never felt more alive. One evening, as Rachel sat at her desk, the soft hum of her laptop in the background, she glanced out the window. The city lights stretched before her, a sea of tiny stars blinking back at her. She felt a quiet smile tug at her lips as she realized something. This was it. This was the life she had been waiting for. This was the life she had chosen for herself. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She stood up from her desk, stretching her arms above her head, and looked at the empty space around her. It wasn't just an apartment. It wasn't just four walls. It was her freedom. It was her future. And she was ready to take on whatever came next. The days that followed Rachel's decision to leave were filled with an odd sense of calm, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something she hadn't expected. A deep and unshakable sense of clarity. She had always believed that leaving Mark would break her, that it would leave a void, a space where she had once been whole. But instead, there was only a quiet, steady rhythm to her life now, like the beat of a drum guiding her forward. She woke up each morning to the soft sunlight streaming through the window, to the feeling of the soft sheets around her, to the scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen. These small moments, once taken for granted, now felt like gifts. She had always believed that her happiness was tied to someone else's approval, to someone else's validation. But now, she was beginning to understand something far more profound, that her happiness, her peace, had always been within her grasp. She had just needed to reach out and claim it. The quiet evenings were no longer filled with the weight of loneliness, though there were moments when she felt the ache of absence. It wasn't loneliness for Mark. It was the absence of something she had once thought would define her. Her role as his wife, her identity within the confines of their marriage. But that Rachel, the one who had lived in the shadows of someone else's expectations, was fading. And in her place, a new Rachel was emerging. A woman who was beginning to rediscover herself, Her first breakthrough came when she revisited an old journal of hers. One she had kept before everything became about Mark, before she had lost sight of her own passions. As she flipped through the pages, she was struck by the dreams she had once had, dreams of traveling, of writing, of starting something of her own. There were ideas scribbled down for novels, for art projects, for businesses. But somewhere along the way, all those dreams had been buried under the weight of his dreams, under the weight of their life. It was as if she had erased herself from the picture. But now, as she read those pages, Rachel realized something. She had always known who she was. She had always had the power within her to be more than just someone's wife. And now she was finally ready to embrace that power again. She had been so consumed with the idea of saving a marriage that she had forgotten what it meant to save herself. And as she read her words, as she remembered the person she had been before she became lost in the labyrinth of Mark's world, a sense of purpose began to blossom in her heart. She wasn't just leaving him. She was reclaiming everything she had left behind. That afternoon, she made a decision. She dusted off her old laptop and opened a new document. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, but then they began to move, slow at first, tentative but with increasing confidence. She began to write. The words flowed freely at first, just like they had years ago, before Mark's influence had silenced her voice. And with each word, each sentence, Rachel felt more alive. She was writing for herself. She was writing her story, and this time, it wasn't a story of heartbreak or loss. It was a story of survival, of strength, of the journey back to herself. The act of writing became her therapy, her way of healing the wounds she hadn't even realized were still there. Each chapter she wrote was a step closer to her true self, to the woman she had always been beneath the layers of self-doubt and insecurity. She began to write with the intention of sharing her story with the world. She didn't know what it would look like, but she knew that this was something she had to do. It wasn't just about words on a page. It was about taking ownership of her life, of her voice, and putting it out there for others to hear. But writing wasn't the only thing Rachel was reclaiming. She had always dreamed of starting her own business, but she had never pursued it, never thought she could. Mark had always convinced her that she wasn't capable, that she didn't have the skills, the knowledge, the drive. But Rachel knew better now. She knew that the only thing standing between her and her dreams was her own fear. Fear of failure. Fear of rejection. Fear of not being enough. And so, she took a deep breath and took the plunge. She enrolled in an online business course, something that had been on her mind for years. The first few days were overwhelming, as she navigated through the material and tried to keep up. But something inside her clicked. She was learning again, she was growing again, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the thrill of pursuing something that was all hers. She had forgotten how much she loved learning, how much she loved challenging herself. Slowly, Rachel began to build the foundation of her business. It wasn't easy. There were days when the doubt crept in, when the old voices from her past, Mark's voice, his dismissive words, tried to find their way back into her mind. But every time those doubts surfaced, Rachel pushed them aside. She didn't need anyone's approval anymore. She didn't need Mark's validation. She had learned that her worth didn't come from anyone else. Came from within. She began to reach out to other women who had faced similar struggles, who had been held back by their own fears and doubts. She connected with them, shared her story, and listened to theirs. It was in these conversations that Rachel found her purpose. She wasn't just rebuilding her own life. She was building a community, a network of strong, supportive women who were all taking control of their lives in their own ways. She knew now that the power of connection, of shared experiences, was one of the most valuable things in the world. It was during one of these conversations that Rachel realized the true extent of her transformation. She had gone from a woman who had been broken, who had been silenced, to someone who was not just surviving, but thriving. She had taken control of her own narrative. She had stopped letting the opinions of others define her. She had stopped playing the role of the dutiful wife, the one who quietly accepted her place in someone else's world. Rachel was no longer the woman who waited for permission. She was no longer the woman who hid behind someone else's shadows. She was the woman who had taken the pen back in her hand and started writing her own story. And the more she wrote, the more she realized that she was just getting started. In the quiet moments, when the world outside was still, Rachel found peace. She found purpose. She found strength. It wasn't a destination, but a journey. And for the first time in years, she was excited to see where it would take her. She had reclaimed her identity. She had reclaimed her voice. And now she was ready for whatever came next. Rachel had never imagined that the day would come when she would need to confront Tom again. But here she was, standing on the precipice of a decision that would change everything. She had spent so many years in the shadows, trying to please him, trying to fix what was broken, trying to make things work even when she knew in her heart it wasn't possible. But that woman, the one who had quietly endured and quietly suffered, was no longer who she was. This new Rachel, the one who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, wasn't going to let Tom or anyone dictate her worth any longer. She had already reclaimed so much. Her confidence, her dreams, her independence. Now it was time to take action. It was time to make him face the truth about what he had done to her, to their marriage, to everything they had built. As she stood in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting the sleeves of her jacket, Rachel felt a surge of determination course through her. Her reflection no longer felt like a stranger. It was the face of a woman who had taken control, who had spent weeks, months even, shedding the weight of Tom's cruelty and manipulation. The woman in the mirror was someone who was strong. She was someone who had learned to trust herself again. And she was ready to take on the world. The plan had been in motion for weeks. Rachel had carefully gathered every bit of evidence she could find, piecing together the lies Tom had woven around their marriage. She had uncovered financial records, messages, photographs, the proof of his affair, of his deceit, of the countless ways he had undermined her. The evidence was damning, and Rachel knew that if she used it, it would destroy the image he had spent years building. But it wasn't just about exposing him to the people around him. It was about reclaiming her power. It was about standing up for herself in a way she never had before. It was about not letting him get away with everything he had done. She drove to his office, her hands steady on the steering wheel, her mind focused on the task ahead. The drive was quiet, the hum of the tires on the road almost soothing in its simplicity. For the first time, Rachel wasn't plagued by the noise of self-doubt. There were no second-guessing thoughts, no wondering if she was doing the right thing. This was the right thing. This was the moment where she took back control, where she forced Tom to see her as more than just a victim. As she pulled into the parking garage, she noticed the familiar cars parked outside. His business partner's vehicles, a few other luxury cars that reminded her of the life Tom had so carefully constructed. The facade of success, of wealth, of a perfect marriage. It was all built on lies. She wasn't going to let him get away with it anymore. She stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath before walking into the building. Her heels clicked with purpose as she moved through the lobby, her head held high, her posture straight. She felt like a woman on a mission because she wasn't just walking into an office building. She was walking into the final chapter of a long, painful story that had dragged on for far too long, and she was ready to end it. Rachel asked for Tom at the front desk, her voice calm and controlled. When she was told that he was in a meeting, she didn't hesitate. She wasn't here to play by anyone's rules anymore. She knew exactly where he would be, his office, the place where he hid behind his polished exterior and his carefully crafted persona. She walked toward the elevators, the silence between each floor giving her the space she needed to center herself. As the doors opened on the top floor, she stepped out, her gaze immediately locking onto the familiar door of Tom's office. For a moment, she stood there, collecting her thoughts, making sure she was ready for this final confrontation. Without knocking, she opened the door. Tom looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from confusion to anger as he saw her standing in the doorway. "Rachel," he said, his voice tight, "what the hell are you doing here?" Her heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. "I'm here to end this," she said simply, her voice unwavering. "I'm here to make you face the truth. Tom's brow furrowed, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk as he stood up, his posture defensive. "What truth?" he demanded, his tone dripping with irritation. "What are you talking about?" Rachel didn't hesitate. She walked toward him, her hand reaching into her bag and pulling out a stack of papers. She placed them on the desk in front of him. "This," she said, her voice cold, "is the truth. Everything you've been hiding, every lie you've told, every secret you've kept. It's all here. I've seen the financial records, the emails, the messages, the photographs. I know about you and Serena. I know what you've done." Tom's face paled, his eyes darting from the papers to Rachel, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. "This is insane," he muttered, but Rachel could hear the crack in his voice. The fear was there, palpable, and it sent a surge of satisfaction through her. "You think this is insane?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but laced with contempt. "What's insane is the way you've treated me. What's insane is how you thought you could get away with everything, that I wouldn't find out, that I would just keep playing the role you assigned me. But I'm done. I'm done with you, and I'm done with the life you've forced me into." For the first time, Tom didn't respond with anger. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked lost. He ran a hand through his hair, the mask slipping for just a second. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice cracking, "please, we can fix this. I didn't mean to hurt you. I made a mistake. I'll do anything to make it right." Rachel's laugh was bitter, a sharp sound that filled the silence between them. "You think you can fix this? You think you can just apologize and make everything go away?" She shook her head, her eyes cold. "You've broken me, Tom. You've broken this marriage. And I'm not going to let you pretend like you can just fix it with words. You can't. Not anymore." He stepped toward her, his desperation now palpable. "Please don't do this. I love you. I'll change. I swear. I'll do anything." Rachel stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "You don't know how to love, Tom. Not really. You don't love me. You love control. You love the power you had over me. But that's over. It's done." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Tom stood there, his face twisted with regret and anger, but Rachel wasn't moved. She had already made her decision. She had already moved on. "I'm leaving you," she said, her voice firm, her decision final. "I'm taking everything back that you've stolen from me. My dignity, my life, my happiness. And I'm going to make sure the world knows who you really are. Because you don't get to destroy me and get away with it." As she turned to walk out of the office, she could feel Tom's eyes on her, his gaze heavy with guilt and fear. But she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already taken her power back. And she wasn't going to let him or anyone take it from her again. With each step she took, Rachel felt stronger. She was leaving him behind. And for the first time in years, she was walking toward the future she had always dreamed of. The days after the confrontation felt like a whirlwind, but in the best way possible. Rachel's life, once dictated by someone else's needs and desires, was now entirely hers to shape. Each morning she woke up with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She spent her days pursuing her goals, small but significant victories that were starting to add up, each one a testament to her newfound strength. But the hardest part was still ahead. Leaving Tom behind was one thing, but moving on from the life she had built with him was another. It wasn't just a physical departure. It was an emotional and psychological shift that she had to embrace fully. One afternoon, as Rachel sat by her window, looking out at the city, the realization hit her. She was no longer tied to the past. The apartment, her new sanctuary, was her space to breathe, to rebuild. The silence that once felt so heavy, so full of emptiness, now felt like a canvas, a space where she could finally paint her own picture. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. The unknown was no longer a threat. It was an opportunity. But even as the new chapter of her life began, there were moments when the weight of her past would slip in, unexpected and uninvited. She would wake in the middle of the night, her body still tense from years of living in survival mode. The absence of Tom's presence in the apartment sometimes felt like a gap, a void that she had grown accustomed to. There were evenings when the loneliness crept in, when the silence seemed too thick to bear. But in those moments, she would remind herself of the strength she had discovered. She would remind herself that loneliness was no longer something she feared. It was simply part of the journey. One evening, Rachel stood in front of her closet, taking a deep breath before picking up the dress she had worn at the dinner party. The fabric felt lighter now in her hands, less like a relic of the past, and more like a symbol of everything she had overcome. Slowly, deliberately, she folded it, placing it at the back of the closet. She wasn't throwing it away. It wasn't about destruction. It was about putting it in its place. That dress, that life, no longer defined her. It was part of her past, and now she was ready to move forward, to embrace a future where she wasn't defined by someone else's vision of her. Rachel spent the next few weeks rediscovering herself in small, almost imperceptible ways. She spent hours at the cafe near her apartment, writing in her journal, capturing her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. She didn't worry about what anyone else thought. It wasn't about approval anymore. It was about self-expression. She started signing up for local events, meeting new people, networking with others who had their own dreams, their own stories of struggle and resilience. She began to build connections, not out of need, but out of a genuine desire to be around people who saw her for who she truly was. Not as Mark's wife, not as someone's background character, but as Rachel. In one of her meetings, she met a woman named Laura. No, not the same Laura who had always been there, but a new Laura, who had been in the business world for years and had a heart for helping others. They hit it off immediately, and before long they started collaborating on projects. The more Rachel worked with Laura, the more she realized how much potential she had, how much she could accomplish on her own. She wasn't relying on anyone for validation anymore. She was carving out her own path. But there was one moment that made it all feel real, one moment that confirmed she was truly moving on. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Rachel was sitting at her desk, reviewing some documents for her latest business venture, when she got a call from Tom. Her heart didn't race. There was no nervousness, no flutter of anxiety. Just a calm, almost detached feeling as she stared at the name on her phone. She knew what it was. She knew what he wanted. But this time it didn't matter. She answered the call, and his voice came through, strained, almost pleading. Rachel, He didn't even have to finish the sentence. She had heard it all before. Tom, she said, her voice steady. I'm not interested in hearing this again. I'm done. I've moved on. And I need you to understand that. You don't get to come back into my life and undo what's been done. There was a long pause on the other end, but this time, there was no guilt-ridden apology, no begging. Just silence. He didn't say anything more. And for the first time, Rachel didn't feel any urge to say more either. There was nothing left to say. She hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, a quiet satisfaction filling her chest. It was done. He was done. And Rachel wasn't going to waste another second looking back. In the following weeks, she kept moving forward. Her consulting business began to grow bit by bit. She started taking on more clients, crafting her own brand, defining her own value. She realized that success wasn't just about the number of clients she had or the amount of money she made. It was about freedom. It was about knowing that she had the power to build something that was all her own. And that was worth more than anything. The loneliness that had once felt suffocating now felt different. It wasn't a silence that spoke of loss, but of potential. Rachel embraced it as a space for her to grow, to discover new layers of herself that she had long since buried. She spent time reading, attending workshops, investing in her personal growth. Every book she picked up, every class she took, every new skill she learned was a step toward becoming the woman she was always meant to be. Then came the moment when she realized she had built something more valuable than success. She had built a life, a real, fulfilling life where she was the architect. The freedom she had gained was not just in her career or her finances, but in her spirit. She wasn't tied to the past anymore. She wasn't waiting for anyone's permission. She was living on her own terms. One evening, Rachel stood by her window, looking out at the city below. The skyline shimmered with lights, reflecting the hope that now glimmered inside her. She smiled softly to herself, a quiet sense of pride swelling in her chest. She had done it. She had rebuilt herself, brick by brick, and in the process, she had rediscovered who she truly was. For the first time, Rachel wasn't afraid of the future. She was excited for it. She was ready for whatever came next because she knew she could handle it. She had learned that nothing could break her. Not the pain, not the heartbreak, not even the years of doubt. She was stronger now, wiser, and more in control of her own destiny than ever before. And the best part? She knew this was just the beginning. She took one last look at the city before turning away, a quiet certainty filling her heart. Her journey was hers alone, and she was ready to embrace it, fully, unapologetically, and with a strength that no one could take away.